Hola! I'm in Cuba, a country that has amazingly survived the fall of its Soviet patron, the USSR, increased isolation and food shortages due in part to a 50-year trade embargo by the USA. But I'm here as a tourist, drinking a $4 mojito and relaxing on the beach. So what the hell does socialism mean? We hear people describe things as socialist all the time, but a lot of the things being called socialism or claiming to be socialist are very, very different from each other. I mean, is communism the same as socialism? Is Cuba socialist? Is China? Is universal healthcare? Is Bernie Sanders? In this way, the word socialist is kind of like how we use the word Christian. You have the Amish, they're Christian, so is Kanye West, and the Russian Orthodox Church, the people who persecuted Galileo, and maybe even your gran. They are all Christians, but when they hold such diverse and indeed contradictory beliefs, what does it mean to call someone a Christian or claim to be one? One tactic we can do is look at what the shared common ground is between most, if not all, of these disparate groups. For example, for Christians, it might be that all your gran and the Spanish Inquisition have in common is a belief that Jesus is the Son of God, that God is good, and that there is some sort of justice in the afterlife. What's the common ground for all socialists then? Well, politics professor Michael Newman distills it into 4 characteristics. Firstly, the belief that humans are not necessarily passive in the face of history, but can construct change in the world. And second, an optimistic assessment of human beings as complex, rather than merely selfish. Next, and perhaps most importantly, a commitment to the creation of an egalitarian society. Following on from that, the belief that it is actually possible to construct an alternative society based on solidarity and cooperation. Who was the first socialist? Jesus, maybe? Plato? Mazdak the Younger? People love debating this, but I'm just going to jump into the 19th century and the first usage of the word socialist. Around this time, there were competing traditions of socialism emerging. On one side was the utopian socialists, and on the other, the anarchist socialists. The utopians responded to the Industrial Revolution with hopeful imaginings of a harmonious world, while the anarchists, who were famous for their slogan, "Property is theft," distrusted authority and so were against the formation of a mass socialist political party, saying, "How can you expect an egalitarian and free society to emerge from an authoritarian organisation? It's impossible." Both the utopians and the anarchists sought to establish communes where they could live out their theories in practice. But the anarchists, maybe you've guessed, didn't get on very well with another bunch of socialists who just wanted to have a big, massive party. Not that kind of party. They were the Marxists. Karl Marx is the single most important figure when it comes to socialism, and it's been pretty difficult not mentioning him until just now. He literally wrote the book on socialism with his longtime collaborator Friedrich Engels. Marx looked around at the inequality in society and saw that people could be divided into 2 classes. There were the Capulets and there were the capitalists who owned all the machines and the factories and the land and made all the profits, and then there were the workers employed by them to do the actual graft. He called the workers the proletariat, the capitalists the bourgeoisie, and the factories and the land and all that stuff the means of production, because you needed to own that stuff in the first place in order to make things to make money. Say you got a job crafting porcelain horses, and for every horse you make, you get paid £10 by your boss. Then one day you go down to the local shop and find that your horses are being sold for £20 each. While it was your labour that produced £20 of value, your boss keeps £10 as profit, with some directed to expenditure on further materials and machines. Marx termed this difference between the wage and the surplus value the rate of exploitation. The tension that arises from you wanting a higher proportion of the £20 for your wages and the boss wanting to increase their profits is part of the reason why Marx saw capitalism as inherently unstable. Since the bourgeoisie owned the means of production, they had the power, and so Marx saw the workers' position being eroded over time and gradually reaching an inevitable crisis point where the proletariat would be forced to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, seizing the means of production for themselves. And if we go to the dictionary, this today is what it will say socialism means: the collective ownership of the means of production. So that's socialism in theory. But what about in practice? With the key ideas established, socialist parties started cropping up all over Europe with the aim of recruiting the working classes to their cause. Predominantly Marxist, they aimed to bring about socialism through 2 different means that were often in tension. First, through democratic reform, small incremental changes to the current capitalist system through government that would improve the lives of workers in the short term. And secondly, through revolution, in order to establish the social ownership of the means of production. And at this time, it was generally held that the reforms were steps towards the revolution rather than instead of it. Then, in 1917, when the Russian Revolution took place, it changed the face of socialism for good. At the beginning of this video, I asked if socialism and communism are the same thing, and the answer is yes. And no. Both terms had been around in the 19th century, but Marx and Engels themselves used them inconsistently, and so there wasn't really a clear distinction between the two. Another man, Vladimir Lenin, was needed to give communism its present-day shape, and he did this by incorporating one major addition to Marx's ideas, that of the vanguard party. Lenin argued that the working classes wouldn't rise up to revolution by themselves. They would need the clear vision of a socialist intellectual elite, a vanguard, to guide the masses through to revolution. It's not hard to see how an authoritarian and anti-democratic regime could result from this elitist perspective. Even Lenin's right-hand man, Leon Trotsky, saw this himself, commenting in 1904, "In inner party politics, these methods lead, as we shall yet see, to this. The party organization substitutes itself for the party, the central committee substitutes itself for the organization, and finally, a dictator substitutes himself for the central committee." After a successful revolution, the party then works to shepherd the nation slowly towards communism, a state of material abundance where everyone's needs are met. In this formulation, a common understanding is that socialism is a sort of transitional society halfway between capitalism and communism. Throughout the 20th century, with the rise of first Lenin, then Stalin in Russia, a number of countries, China, Cuba, Vietnam, all turned to the one-party state model of socialism, although none to date have achieved communism in the above terms. So, it looks like the revolutionary side of socialist parties got their fill. But what about those who preferred incremental constitutional reforms? This position is known as social democracy, and many parties recoiling from the terrors unleashed in Russia by the communists committed to this as the way forward. Socialism had split in two. Social democrats would aim to gain power through elections rather than revolution. They would formulate policies that would curb the excesses of capitalism, all the while their prerogative was helping the working classes. The irony was that social democracy was a failure on its own terms in the interwar period. For example, in response to the capitalist disaster that was the Great Depression, it was two non-socialists that actually made the most headway, both practically and theoretically, in reforming capitalism. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal invoked huge public spending projects that created jobs and provided new infrastructure to the United States, while John Maynard Keynes developed his economic theories that promoted government intervention during financial downturns. Both provided models for the Social Democrats to implement in the years following the Second World War that I bet they wish they'd came up with themselves. Except, there is one notable success story of social democracy that began early, and it's exactly where you'd expect. Sweden. 20th century Sweden is just really, really interesting. For example, between 1932 and 1991, one party, the Social Democratic Party, received 40% of the vote in every election. It was this sustained period of democratic mandate that allowed the party to make the sort of headway that misty-eyed Western socialists can only dream of. How did the party manage to achieve such a vote of confidence from the Swedish people though? Well, they were the people. At its height, 1.2 million people were members of the party, and Sweden's population at the time was only 8.4 million. Policies were also formulated by the closely linked trade union, which had the highest rate of membership in the world. And add to this the notion of folkhemmet, which encouraged the public to think of the nation as a home, one in which no one was privileged above anyone else and everyone worked together. Sweden during this time was characterised as linking socio-economic equality with economic efficiency, and to this end eschewed the traditional socialist idea of collective ownership in favour of wage controls and the expansion of the public sector. At the heart of everything was democracy and real participation, and a clever bargaining strategy with the country's capitalist class. After around 40 or so years of smooth sailing, things took a downward turn in 1980 when, among other things, the party pushed the capitalists too far by attempting to force them to give company shares to employees in proportion to profits made yearly, a step in the direction of collective ownership of the means of production. The employers staged demonstrations, and by 1990 the bargaining structure fell apart. Joining the EU with all its economic directives in 1995 was the final death knell of the unique societal structure. Nowadays, there isn't a consensus if Sweden is still a social democracy, but for a while, it seemed to work pretty well. So we've seen that socialism can mean many things, but even within one-party communist states or countries that lean towards social democracy, there are still great differences even there and intricacies at play. Since its inception, the meaning of socialism has never been static. There have always been competing traditions in a continuous theoretical upheaval. And we've also seen that the implementation of socialism did much to harm the ideology's credibility as the solution to capitalism's problems. But for as long as people perceive the current system to be one of systematically entrenched injustice and inequality, there'll always be those imagining ways to overhaul it. Thanks for watching. That was What the Hell Does Socialism Mean? If you want to find out what other things mean, I've recently done a video about insanity. Are you mad? Am I mad? Check out the video. Next video coming up in 2 weeks will be about science. See you then.